I'm delighted to welcome back to Outsiders one of my very favourite Australian politicians, because he is prepared to stand up in the face of aggression, ridicule even, intimidation and leftist stupidity for what he believes in. The Liberal member for Hughes, Craig Kelly. Mate, welcome back. Just because Outsiders was off air for a couple of weeks, you go and decide to slum it with some poxy pommy show called Good Morning Britain or something with that buffhead Piers Morgan and a bunch of hysterical climate-loving Sheilas. Mate, what were you thinking?
Well, look, when you go on these programs, Rowan, you go on in good faith and you expect the presenters of those shows to also be acting in good faith. Now, they didn't do that. That was a complete setup. They weren't interested in the facts that we had to say. And what Rita just said is so important. We need to get the facts out in this debate. Morgan's going on about all of Australia is on fire. The reality
let's just Craig, I'll just stop you. Let's just have a quick reminder of the of that ridiculous Piers Morgan interview. Just have a listen to this.
Well, Piers, you have to look at the science and what our scientists are telling us. And the three factors that cause the bushfires is firstly the fuel loads. Now, we have record fuel loads on the ground here. That's the bush that accumulates over the years. And every single Royal Commission we've had from our past bushfires has said we have to reduce those fuel loads.
You have the second highest carbon emission per person on Earth, and you are burying your head in the sand. This is a climate emergency. You're not a climate sceptic, you're a climate denier.
Hang on a minute. Hang on. There's a few issues there. Firstly, the first 20 years of this century, we have had more rainfall in Australia than the first 20 years of the last century. So if you look at the
yes, there's more extreme weather. You're right. There is more extreme weather.
In Australia. The numbers, they are
Your
the facts.
Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, his response to these fires erupting all over Australia was to go on holiday to Hawaii. Why did he do that?
Well, firstly, one thing you have to understand about our fire regime and our firefighting regime, it is state-based. It is the state premiers. We have separate state firefighting forces. Now,
we appreciate you joining us. We've got to leave it there. I've got to say, wake up.
Thank you.
Wake up. Climate change and global warming are real.
So, Craig, I mean, what a joke. And I'll just say to that buffhead Piers Morgan, you had one of the smartest guys in Australia who knows more about our bush, more about our climate, more about what's going on, and you chose to play like a bunch of hysterical little 16-year-old Swedish schoolgirls. Oh, climate denier, climate change. That is a joke, and you let your viewers down. Let me just say that. Craig Kelly, many people have come out and applauded you for telling the truth about the bushfires. Talk us through exactly what has happened over the last couple of months in Australia.
Well, firstly, we've got to look at the history of Australian bushfires to try and put this into some context. Now, I remember my own experiences. I was living up at Alfred's Point in 1994, and I actually bought a house with a lot of help from the bank, right up there next to the bush. And I remember my old grandmother coming and telling me, "You're too close to the bush. You're a danger of bushfire." And I'm thinking to myself, silly old woman, what does she know? And when we had those fires in '94, I realised how wrong I was and how little I knew. So I spent 25 years, and especially since I've been a member for an area that's really affected by bushfires in the past and will be in the future, I've done everything I can to educate myself on this subject. Now, one thing that we know is our great history of bushfires. We go back, the first really bad bushfire here we had in Australia was Black Tuesday back in 1851. Now, the talk there was 47 degrees in Melbourne at 11:30 a.m. with a howling northwesterly wind. Something like 5 million hectares was burnt just in Melbourne alone. And there's a great historic picture of that done by William Strutt, which shows the devastation. Remember, that was back before 1851. Absolutely. There was no cameras, there was no mobile phones, there was no hysterical reporting. This was a magnificent painting. It's 3.5 metres long. It's down in the gallery in Melbourne. Every Australian should go and see it. Then you had the fires. You had terrible fires again. It was called Red Tuesday back in 1898. Terrible fires again. They talked about, sort of a plague of bushfires with 3/4 of the colony on fire. Wow. Then you moved on. Of course, there were all fires throughout other years, but then the really big one was those 1939 fires, which were the Black Friday fires. And when you look at some of the maps, there was an area burnt during those 1939 fires from the outskirts of Melbourne all the way through to the outskirts of Canberra. and we talk about mega fires today. That was the mega fire of mega fires. So that's our history of bushfires. Yes, what we've seen this year has been catastrophic, and it's been terrible. And a lot of people have suffered a lot, and we've lost a lot of great Australians and a lot of great firefighters. But we've got to put this in some historical context. We are a land, as they say, of drought and flooding rains, and bushfires are part of the Australian environment.
And we've let the fuel loads build up to such an extent that many people have predicted that we would see these fires this summer.
Well, look, you can go through and why have these fires been so devastating and so widespread? One is the fuel loads, and one is also what we look at, that forest fire index. Now, there's actually, that's where you see those boards, and they've got low risk, high risk, catastrophic risk. There's actually a mathematical formula that puts together to give that forest fire index number, which is up to 100, then over 100 is considered catastrophic. Now, in that formula, yes, temperature is a part, but it's only a very small part. And in fact, a 1 degree increase in temperature increases that forest fire index by 2 points. But that's offset by a 1.5 miles per hour wind reduction. And a 1% humidity reduction also offsets it. So we know when they talk about global warming, yes, you can argue there's a small increase in temperatures, but there's also, as the science says, there's been a decrease in wind speeds, an increase in humidity, and they offset each other. So when you look at the science, the increase in temperatures only plays an absolute minute role. The real issues is the wind speed, which makes it bad, and that the fuel on the ground. And we can look at that with the satellites, we can look at that with the data, and everything tells us we've allowed that fuel on the ground to get at record levels.
Now, I want to ask you about the politicisation of the bushfires. I mean, that was quite remarkable, because at times of national tragedy, we typically all come together.
Correct.
But not this time. People were saying ScoMo had blood on his hands. And I remember, obviously, the Black Saturday fires, 173 people died.
Sure.
No one would have dreamt of blaming then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd for them, or trying to hold him accountable for firefighting efforts. What's your response to that? And do you think Scott Morrison mishandled that? He seemed to be completely losing the plot in how to actually counter that prevailing media narrative and the attacks against him.
Look, firstly, you're right. These fires have brought out the best of Australians and the worst of Australians. The best of Australians, we've seen those firefighters on the ground, the community spirits, people helping their neighbours. That's the best of Australia. The worst of Australia has been those political hacks that are trying to use this bushfire crisis and are dancing on top of the graves of, burnt out houses, saying climate change, climate change. Because the reality is this: they keep talking about bushfires, but when you look at the data, the worldwide data on the satellites from NASA, they show since 2003, since the satellite data started, there's been a 25% decline in wildfires around the world. And that's upset a lot of these lovies. So they've seen this bushfires in Australia, and they wanted to exploit it for their own political advantage, and that has been an absolute disgrace.
I agree with you. Now,
Scott Morrison let that happen, didn't he?
Well,
he did not handle that well. He almost looked guilty. It's like he started believing what he was hearing in the press and behaving accordingly.
To be fair to Scott, remember these fires, first we had them in Queensland, and as you said in the past, the tradition has been in this country, whoever was the leader during a crisis, you go back to the Queensland floods, all back through every crisis we had, no one, while the crisis was going on, politics kept out of it. The media didn't go into the blame game. In this, they've ripped up those rule books. They saw it a chance to kick the coalition government, relitigate the climate change election that they lost, and put the boot into our Prime Minister, who I think truly,
I actually think he's handled it well. I disagree, Rita.
An excellent job.
Handled it well.
He's gone down.
His comments at the National Press Club, where he was basically saying that climate change, if you believe in it, global warming is a cumulative issue, and therefore it is ridiculous to try and pin it down to Australia and say that if we did this, it would mitigate our bushfires. Just very, very quickly, Craig, while we've got you, tell us about the ABC. The Boxing Day cricket test is going to be cancelled. What's going on?
Well, I must admit, I'm a bit of a cricket tragic, and I love my Boxing Day test, and I know millions of others Australians do the traditional thing to sit there on a Boxing Day and watch the cricket test. Well, the ABC came up with this article that they said, well, the Boxing Day tests in future could be cancelled because, if you guessed it, global warming and climate change. So they said it'll be too hot. So I thought, look, whenever you hear these claims, you know 95 times out of 100, they're exaggerating or telling lies. So I thought we'd go to the Bureau of Meteorology's website and have a look. And Chris Gillum over in Western Australia does a lot of research in this. He actually got all the dates from Boxing Day, the highest temperatures in Melbourne, and guess what? He found there's a decreasing trend. Actually, the Boxing Days in Melbourne over the last century have actually been getting cooler. And that's what the ABC could have looked that up in about 5 minutes worth of research, but no, they went with hysterical.
So if it keeps getting cooler, the wicket will be frozen.
I said in 440 years, if the trend continues, yes, we'll have a freezing temperature on Boxing Day.
Craig Kelly, thanks so much for coming back onto Outsiders. Keep up the great work. And Piers Morgan, you are a buffhead for not actually listening to this man.